Hello and welcome. Airplanes can travel for thousands of kilometres across the world. The world has been made so small that it is easy to overlook some of the forgotten parts. Airplanes are travelling through the sky pretty much everywhere on Earth at all times. But if you look at a live global air traffic map right now and pan over to Asia, you will see nothing over this massive area regardless of when you do this. It always appears that all the world's airplanes are simply avoiding this huge area and going out of their way to fly around it, as if it is some kind of forbidden zone to travel over. It's not like it's the middle of the ocean. This is the huge area of land directly over Asia, the most heavily populated continent. So why is this happening? There are lots of reasons, but before we get into that, you need to know about some of the region's aviation history. The zone in question is over the geographic region known as the Tibetan Plateau, one of the world's biggest wastelands. After Antarctica and northern Greenland, the Tibetan Plateau is one of the world's least hospitable places for humans to live in the entire world and is the most sparsely populated. It is an area that is over 5 times larger than France, yet with a population of just a little over 14 million people. So few people live here because the plateau's average elevation is over 4,500 metres, which is 14,700 feet, making the Tibetan Plateau the highest geographic region in the world and earning it the nickname the Roof of the World. The nickname is aptly deserved because the Roof of the World has been one of the biggest obstacles to aviation for decades. The first large-scale attempts to fly over the plateau was during the Second World War, when the Allies in what was then British India needed to airlift supplies into China in the fight against the Japanese. The route wasn't especially far, typically from eastern India into Kunming in China, a distance of 840 kilometres. This was, however, over remote mountains and the high steppes of the Tibetan Plateau. The pilots faced extremely violent turbulence, winds of up to 320 kilometres per hour, temperatures cold enough to freeze their fuel, weather events that were difficult to predict, no emergency airports that they could divert to in the event of an accident, let alone the occasional intervention of Japanese fighters. All these hazards added up to an incredibly dangerous flight path that over 42 months saw 594 planes and 1,659 men who were lost in the mountains, never to be seen again. The vast majority of these losses were a simple result of the dangerous elements that pilots were flying through, and not a result of enemy action. For reference, the loss of life of the Allied air crew here was even higher than during the entire Battle of Britain against the Germans. In some months, as many as 50% of all Allied planes that flew the route were crashing, which today would not be an acceptable loss rate to a modern airliner. For the modern airliners, the Tibetan Plateau has been gradually opened up in the decades since the Second World War. The first airport in Chinese Tibet was built in 1956, and the modern airport in the capital Lhasa was built in 1955. Today, there are 2 significant international airports located on the Tibetan Plateau, namely Lhasa and Xinan. These primarily handle domestic air travel to and from the rest of China. Lhasa has a single international flight to Kathmandu, while Xinan maintains flights to Tokyo, Taipei and Kuala Lumpur. So it is true that there are sometimes planes flying over the Tibetan Plateau, but almost every international flight between Eastern Asia and the West will go out of their way to avoid flying over it. Take this flight, or this flight, just as a handful of examples. So now that we have gone through some history lessons, why do most airliners continue to avoid flying over Tibet in their longer flights today, despite the existence of modern international airports? It really comes down to 4 primary reasons. First is the stupidly high risk of emergency situations. Think of it like this. The average elevation of the Tibetan Plateau is well over 14,000 feet, and airliners cruise at over 30,000 feet. Normally not a problem, but under certain critical emergency situations like cabin depressurization or engine failure events, airline protocol is to descend to 10,000 feet. In a cabin depressurization, oxygen masks will deploy for passengers to breathe, but there is only enough oxygen for about 20 minutes. This is intended to be enough time for the plane to descend to 10,000 feet where normal breathing conditions can be resumed. Now, obviously, this isn't possible over the vast Tibetan Plateau where to descend would result in a crash. If a cabin depressurization happened over Tibet, the only nearby major international airport safe enough and close enough for most big airliners to divert to in an emergency are Lhasa, Shinan, Chengdu, Kathmandu, Urumqi and Almaty. These are hundreds or thousands of kilometres from each other, and they mostly ring around the plateau. When a plane flies from Kathmandu to Lhasa, for example, Kathmandu and Lhasa are each the alternate emergency airport in addition to being the destination airport. In 2018, a Szechuan Airlines flight was flying from Chongqing to Lhasa at 30,000 feet when a window blew out. Fortunately, the pilots weren't very far across the plateau, and so they were able to turn around and land at Chengdu within 35 minutes. The further over the plateau, the more dangerous the emergency becomes because of distance to the nearest airport as passengers suffer lack of oxygen. This leads to problem number 2. There is very few people who live there, and so there isn't a demand for flights. Long-haul international flights between Europe and Asia will avoid flying over Tibet because they don't want to risk having an emergency situation there. There aren't many shorter domestic flights either because of so few people. The Tibet Autonomous Region in China has just over 3 million people. Despite Tibet taking up 13% of China's land area, it only accounts for 0.2% of China's population of 1.39 billion people. The next 2 reasons why long-haul flights avoid flying over Tibet are the bad turbulence and the risk of jet fuel freezing. As fast wind moves over the mountains, the wind will often take a wave-shaped pattern. And when planes fly over this, the turbulence can get so extremely bumpy, which can further complicate any emergency scenario. Finally, there is the problem of jet fuel. Theoretically, jet fuel freezes when the temperature gets below minus 40 degrees centigrade. And whilst extremely cold conditions like that rarely take place anywhere jets fly, the temperatures in the air above the already high and cold Tibetan Plateau can get to that point or worse. This isn't really a problem for short flights through, but for longer flights across the plateau for 6 hours or more, this could become a significant problem. Ultimately, the big reasons why aeroplanes most always avoid flying over the Tibetan Plateau to get to their destinations is a simple reality. Were they to experience an emergency while flying across, it would perhaps be the most dangerous place to be over any of the inhabited continents. It is a reminder that despite our advanced, connected, safe and small world, there are still wild and remote areas to avoid flying over. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to promote further stories.